And welcome, Hoosier Nation, to our 81st episode of the Hoosier Sound, where we are the official podcast of Indiana HQ. Our mission and goal is simple. We want to bring in-depth analysis and coverage for Indiana University sports to as many fans as possible across a multitude of modern platforms. We are recording this edition of the Hoosier Sound on Wednesday evening, March 27, 2019, where I am your host, Noah Freeman. You can catch our live broadcast Tuesday evenings at 8:30 p.m. on our YouTube page or our website. If you missed the live broadcast, you can subscribe to our show for free on whatever platform you listen to podcasts, so you can listen on your own time. Check out our Twitter and Facebook at The Hoosier Sound and at Indiana HQ and subscribe and turn on that bell. All right, Hoosier Nation, it is time for some sports talk. On the docket tonight, sadly, our college basketball season is over as both the men's and women's team lost in the past week. The men lost to Wichita State last night, 73-63, to end their NIT Tournament run. We're just going to reflect on this season and see how it can kind of help build for the future. Here to help me tonight, we have the gang all back together for this episode. Matthew Lukens and Nathan Christian. Matt, let's start with you. What are your initial thoughts on just what happened? We'll start with the past week or so.
We've fought through the NIT. We avenged our early season heartbreaking loss to Arkansas earlier this year. And then we followed up with a depressing performance against Wichita State that could only be the best synopsis of how the season has gone. It started off with a bunch of promise. Then we went through a rough patch. Then we got it back together. And then it ends slightly disappointing, just like the season had. I think when we were asked at the beginning of the year what we would think the season would be a success, I think we all thought it would be a success if we made it to the NCAA tournament. And so in that case, I don't think this was a success this full season. I think there's some positives to take out of the season, even though it doesn't seem like that right now. And there's some bright things on the future for IU basketball, but it just kind of sucks right now. I'm a little salty that it was my last game last night, so that's my initial reaction.
Yeah, for some context, Matt, that as he means that was his last game. Matt's a senior, so he's leaving. That was the last time he got to go to a game, do all the extra stuff with the band. So
right.
Matt did not get to. He only saw 1 year of NCAA tournament Hoosiers. So
well, at least
it was his freshman year.
At least I got to see a good year, though. So
yes, so there's some context as Matt wanted to leave his senior year on a big high. But what about you, Nathan?
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for listening again. Look, all in all, it was just it's just a disappointing conclusion to a season that was really a roller coaster. I mean, there were ups, right? The wins over Michigan State, the demolition of Marquette back in November. There were some ups, but at the same time, there were plenty of downs, right? The losing streak in January into February, and those losses to Ohio State, which probably did the Hoosiers NCAA tournament chances in. And then you have this disappointing loss to end the season. We saw a lot of the similar trends that we saw during that losing streak kind of resurface in this game against Wichita State, where the team had difficulty scoring, and they struggled to crack 60 in this one. Look, they seemed a bit bogged down. They seemed a bit worn out. Injuries were a concern, right? With no Romeo Langford available in this one, and even Race Thompson kind of struggling through some things. It was just kind of, like Matt said, a pretty fitting conclusion to an overall kind of to a season that kind of ended with a whimper, in all honesty.
Yeah. And okay, so let's talk about expectations coming into the season and where the season ended up going. Let's try and remember all the way back to August, September, October, into everything. What was and of course everyone's going to have different opinions and everything, but Matt, putting aside everything that happened during the year, what was your expectation going into the season? Expectation, not this is what you would like. What was your expectation for the season?
I thought we would have been like a 7 or 8 seed in the tournament. And to be honest, we were 1 or 2 wins away from that. So it's not like this season was absolutely depressing because they didn't meet my They didn't meet my expectations, but it's just, it's just slightly disappointing. It hurts right now in the moment. I'm sure I'll look back on it and go, well, we almost got there. If we, Arkansas tip goes in, Jordan Bohannon doesn't go Jordan Bohannon on us, and one lucky bounce here or there, and we're in the tournament. So,
what about you, Nathan?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I was a little bit higher than most on IU coming into the year. It was a team that, look, Romeo Langford joined the club. I saw Juwan Morgan, who he deserved a shout out a few minutes ago. Morgan was really good once again during the NIT, finished with another 20-plus point performance in his last game in Assembly Hall. But I was looking forward to seeing Juwan Morgan kind of combined with Romeo Langford, and I was hoping for a few more guys to step up. And look, it's not it's not all their fault. Injuries happened. Not saying that's a be-all, end-all excuse for everything, but it's definitely noticeable. And IU also didn't have a top 75 freshman in Jerome Hunter available this year. So given all these different factors, look, I think I was maybe a little bit too optimistic about this team. I thought if they could find some jump shooting, which really never happened until maybe Devontae Green in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah,
I thought if IU could find some jump shooting, they could make a really long run in the NCAA tournament. I'm talking about Elite Eight and beyond. Look, those things never happened. They never found a jump shooter. They didn't have Jerome Hunter. Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan had ups and downs through the year. So that's kind of where it is. Starting next year, IU's got to make the big dance. I don't think there's anything else to say about that.
Yeah, and I was trying to think back to the very beginning of the year and listening to other people's opinions on podcasts and where we thought everyone was going to be by the end of the season, just because it's a new coach. You got Romeo coming in, you got Juwan coming off of a high year, but you also have a new team, a lot of freshmen, and like, where is this team going to go? And Crimson Cast, our friends over at Crimson Cast, we've had them on before. I think they're one of the more realistic podcasts when they like to give predictions out. And from what I gathered from a lot of the more national media in terms of IU national media, I think everyone was expecting Indiana to be right around the bubble this year. And I don't know if you guys agree or disagree, but I think most people were like, Indiana's going to be either pretty slightly in or just kind of comfortably in or just slightly out of it. And if you look at it from that perspective, Indiana doesn't necessarily this season isn't disappointing, because you also think last year, did Indiana even make the NIT? No, they didn't. So this is still technically a year that improved despite everything that actually went on. I think what that made this season disappointing was that we started with that such a strong record. We started only with 2 losses and beat a lot of big teams. And then we had the losing 12 of 13. So I think the disappointment came from having such a strong start and then just kind of throwing it all away, and then almost making it even more disappointing having such a strong finish for most of the games to see, oh, this is what this team could have been. And this is what it might have been if, like Matt said, a couple of bounces would have gone our way. We could have brought some shooters, maybe had a couple less injuries. And so in another way, you could also say that this season was extremely successful because you don't have a couple injuries. Maybe one person on the team decides to shoot, and this team could have potentially had a top 3, top 4 seed, like we said this team's ceiling was at the very beginning of the year. So I think it's just hard. I don't think it's as easy as saying, oh, this is a terrible season, because I don't think it's as easy just at least to make that blank statement. I don't know about you guys. I'll let Nathan jump in a second, but there's just so many factors that went into it, and I think it's hard to judge, at least within one sentence.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, Noah, because I'm looking at the 8 guys that took the floor last night for IU against Wichita State. Of course, Romeo Langford was out for this game due to a back injury, but I'm looking at the guys who played. Robert Finnessy, he missed games during the year. Devontae Green was suspended. Juwan Morgan has been banged up. I remember he was unavailable for most of that Michigan State game in East Lansing. Race Thompson, he missed a bunch of games this season. Zach McRoberts, the same thing. Deron Davis, same thing. Really, of the 8 guys that played last night, I believe that's Al Durham and Justin Smith were the only 2 guys who were pretty mube available all year, and I may even be wrong about that. So again, not a be-all, end-all excuse, but as you said, Noah, there were a lot of contributing factors.
Mm-hmm. What any thoughts on anything we've said, Matt?
Yeah, I think IU basketball's been hanging out with IU football a little bit too much. Good starts and then, having a bad middle of the season and then getting our hopes up at the end just to crush our soul. That, and secondly, I liked your point about how the start kind of threw a wrench in things. I do think starting 12-2 and giving everybody a bit of glimpse of hope and kind of seeing into what this team could have been, and then all the injuries hit and bad form hits, kind of really rubbed people the wrong way. And I think giving a month or two to without basketball and kind of look back on the season, you'll go, well, if Rob Finney doesn't get injured, we at least win probably 2 or 3 of those games. And that's that tough stretch that, by the way, we knew was going to be tough in the first place, even before we got into the season, because we talked about how tough January was going to be and how we were probably going to lose 5 or 6 games in January. And guess what? We lost 7 games in January. So we did a little bit under our expectations, but
our first January podcast was titled The January Gauntlet.
Exactly. Like, we knew this was going to happen. We knew there was going to be a slump in the middle of the season, right? And if Ohio State doesn't get Caleb Wesson back, right, from his suspension, we might be looking at an NCAA tournament run right now, and this wouldn't be an issue. So I don't think this season was a failure. I do think it feels like right now that we wasted Romeo. I don't think we wasted Romeo. I think Romeo has some room to improve. I don't think he was as good as people thought he was coming out of high school, but that's because they thought he was going to be like a top 3 draft pick and not a top 10 draft pick. And by God, he's still going to be a top 10 draft pick, and you think otherwise, you're dumb. And yeah, I mean, I just don't think the season was a failure at all. I think we should look back on the season fondly, especially as Archie gets the program up and running, back to the NCAA tournament next year, which I fully expect that we will be back, as long as everybody's healthy. And then, maybe even 5 or 6 years down the line, we'll look back and laugh at this season and be like, what could have been, and how crazy the fans were to think that Archie Miller should be fired. So
yeah, this podcast is being recorded the day after the season end, so the tone might reflect that a little bit the day after Indiana losing. But you talked about Romeo and his stock and everything. You also we've said it before, but you also have to keep remembering Romeo's being compared to Zion and RJ Barrett and Cam Reddish and all of those big names, which are just abnormally good for an average top end of the outgoing recruits, I guess, the incoming NBA draft class. So do you think, with Matt, do you think this season would have a different feel, different connotation, if we did not lose 12 of 13 in a row and the losses were more spread out? So maybe we lose to Butler, but win some, and we don't have as much. We have a 10-10 conference record, but we lost a couple more games in the non-conference or something like that. I'll start with Matt. Do you think the disappointment would be the same, or do you think it would just be maybe a little different since the ups and downs weren't there and it was more consistent?
I think the season would have been better without the ups and downs, just because I feel like we went so down at a certain point that people were like, the season's over. And then we brought it back to ruin our dreams almost, I think spacing out the losses and wins together, you kind of would have gotten like okay, maybe this team isn't as good as we thought it was, right? Isn't you're like, you're spacing out the expectations, but starting 12-2 and being like, well, we could be in a running for a Big Ten championship, to then going 8-12 in the conference, losing 12 of 13, right? Like that threw a wrench in everything. So I do think that if everything had been spaced out, the season would be looked back on it right now much differently than it is going to be looked at.
Before I let Nathan jump in there, to add on to that question, do you think Indiana would be in the tournament if their losses were spaced out? Same thing, same wins against the nice big teams. No.
Nathan, what do you think?
No, I don't think so, because as much as people don't want to believe it, as far as the NCAA tournament goes, the sequencing doesn't matter. It just depends on who the teams are. So, I think that's kind of the bigger deal. To answer the first question though, Noah, as far as if it would feel better if IU had sort of spread their losses out, I think IU would have done better if the scheduling of their Big Ten games was a little bit more favorable. Just kind of zooming out a little bit, you had that home game against Northwestern, who ended up last in the conference, back in December, when everything was going pretty swimmingly relative to the rest of the season. You had a home game against Illinois in very early January, before the losing streak began. And then you fast forward all the way to the beginning of March, where senior day was the home game against Rutgers. So really your three most winnable games in the conference this year all took place either way before the losing streak or way after. And then even want to consider a Nebraska team that finished in the bottom four of the conference, you played them when they were at full strength. So again, I think IU, I'm gonna go to my grave saying that this IU team kind of got a bad sequence, a bad set of circumstances this year. I understand the record wasn't all that great, but I just feel like there's some external factors that really could have helped them. And now we'll see. Now we'll see what happens next year, right? This 2018-19 season can either be remembered as a stepping stone for sustained success starting next season, or it could be just another year where things stalled. And I guess, starting in November, we'll find out how this thing goes.
Yeah, but before we move on to the next part, I do want to give a preface. First of all, if you hear anything like a very loud toilet flush, Matt's roommate, their toilet is extremely loud. So yeah, that is what that is. And if you hear a lot of beeping, Nathan, right before the show, he had a smoke detector basically lose its battery. So we're hitting the jackpot with external noises tonight. But anyway, I'm going to take Who Won the Week for this week. And originally, and I still kind of want to put an asterisk on this, and I do think the women's basketball team does deserve a shout out, even though they did lose to Oregon on Sunday evening, but they got their third ever NCAA tournament win on Friday against Texas. Matt was there. He can probably later talk a little bit about just how cool that trip was, because again, I'm really jealous that he got to go all the way to Oregon and jump in probably the very cold water. But they third ever win. Terry Moran has 2 of those 3 wins. So like in terms of IU women's coaches, man, I think we found a coach that hopefully doesn't do so well that we lose her so quickly. But if she does, then again, the women's basketball team is doing really good, which we do have a really good question, by the way, for the end of the show that talks a little bit more about the future of the women's basketball team, which hint, it's probably very bright. But I am going to give this to the women's swimming and diving program. Around this time of year, you kind of have to give it to them, just with the tradition and the history with the swimming and diving. They had their NCAA championship this past weekend, and no, the women don't historically do quite as good as the men do, but they are right under them. They finished 9th this year, which I talked about this in the Hoosier Sound Off. That means they finished in the top 10 for 5 straight seasons, which is a program record. This is the 10th time in program history that they finished in the top 10. They scored 179 overall points, which is the 3rd most in school history. Over the weekend, they had 10 athletes that earned a total of 19 All-American honors. The list goes on and on. They became the women's swimming and diving program became the first Big Ten program in the Big Ten history to have at least one NCAA title in 6 straight years. So that means an individual person on the team winning an NCAA title, which Lily King backed it up the last few years. But speaking of Lily King, she made her own history, became the first woman in NCAA history to win 8 breaststroke titles. So just hats off to the women's swimming and diving program. I can guarantee next week who's going to win the weekend. It's going to be the men's swimming and diving program. They've got their championship this weekend, which, by the way, you can watch. So if you're not watching some basketball, watch it. It's actually really interesting. But let's move on to some individual players within this past year. And I don't want to go over every single person because we'll be here for 5 hours, but let's talk about a few individuals that
it's not normally our podcast.
Yeah, but we'll talk about a few individuals that probably had high expectations. And I want to start with Juwan Morgan. And I think he exceeded a lot of expectations, but then again, there's some people that thinks he under exceeded things, and he didn't do as good as people might have thought, and he wasn't an All-American player. So, Nathan, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on just Juwan Morgan's senior season, how he played, maybe how he's also wrapping up going into his post-IU basketball career?
Geez, I think it's pretty harsh for anyone to say that Juwan Morgan fell below expectations. Let's all remember that this is a guy who, I mean, he wasn't a 5-star prospect or anything coming out of high school. For a guy from Missouri to basically come into Bloomington, Indiana, and establish an identity, he deserves all the credit in the world. He finished in the top 25 all time in scoring for IU basketball, and he was close, ranked highly in other categories like rebounds and blocks as well. Yeah.
I think it was 10th, 9th or 10th in rebounds, and 8th, and then 8th in blocks, I think is what it was.
I mean, that's insane to finish in the top 10 in IU basketball history in critical categories like rebounding and block shots, where you've got some incredible names in the past that you're up there with. It's just outstanding. And here's a guy who averaged 16.5 points a game last year. He averaged 15.5 this season. There are only 2 other players in recent IU memory that can really claim that accomplishment, and that's Yogi Ferrell, James Blackman, and Cody Zeller as well. So, I mean, that's what we're talking about. Juwan Morgan deserves to be discussed in that kind of category with a Yogi Ferrell or a Cody Zeller. That's the kind of impact he made. And as far as the NBA goes, indications are that he could possibly hear his name called in the 2nd round of the draft coming up in June. And even if he doesn't get drafted, it's not like he can't make a roster anywhere in the league. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. I think he'll have a role either in the G League or in the NBA, just as a rebounding forward who can hit a jump shot if needed and also score in the post as a guy coming off the bench. There's absolutely a role for a spot for players like that in the NBA, and I think Juwan Morgan could fill it.
I wanted to interrupt and add on to what Nathan was saying, remember, he basically didn't play his freshman year either, and he was injured for half of his sophomore year. So he's done all of those records within basically 2 years, but 2.5 years more or less. So, Matt, what are your thoughts on Juwan Morgan's, not just his career, but also just this overall season?
Yeah. he is going to go down as one of the better players to play at IU, just like from a college standpoint, and not from the NBA standpoint, but because I don't think he'll be an NBA player. I think he'll be a G League player if he's lucky. But I think we've been blessed to have him, and I think he came at, he was a year or two early. I think, if he was sophomore Juwan right now, I think this program would be in a much, much better place. But it's just his time came too soon, and it's kind of sad. But at least he got that 1 year. He didn't play very much his freshman year, but at least he got that 1 year. And he when he did play, he looked promising. And then his sophomore year, it wasn't the greatest year for him, obviously, because he's fighting through injuries, and his season was kind of disappointing. But if he had been healthy, I think he would have been an important cog on that team. And then you look, last year was disappointing, but he put up great numbers, and he was our, one positive point out of the season until Romeo committed. And then this year he's been our rock, and we're gonna miss that next year. So I mean, I have nothing but respect for the guy. Obviously graduating with him is going to be fun, and something that I'll remember. So, but yeah, I mean, when we look back, and they do, pick 5 people you want all-time IU team, I think he'll be in a person that is in the discussion, at least for one of the forward roles, and that's about all you can ask for when playing for a program as storied.
He'll be the Zach McRoberts of those all-time great players for this team.
Right. Yeah.
What were you gonna say, Nathan?
No, I was gonna say, fortunately with Indiana HQ this year, I think you and I have been able to attend games throughout the season, and the one thing that maybe those of you listening may not know is that Juwan Morgan's always facing the music after every game. It doesn't matter win or loss. He's always available to talk with the media after games are done. After a win, he's on top of the world. After a loss, he's he explains. He's very forthright and clear cut with how the game went. He doesn't hide. He hasn't cowered away from the spotlight, even when the team had lost 12 out of 13. I just think that deserves, I think he deserves some credit for that, because it's not easy when you're only 22 or 23 years old.
Yeah, and to almost counteract what Matt said coming, he was a little early. I think this season would have been a little more of a disaster if he wasn't here with some of his leadership experience, because remember
absolutely.
he's the last guy on the team to have NCAA tournament experience. After this year, remember Devontae and Duran are 2 guys that came in right after IU's last run in the tournament. So he had that experience. And like we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, we talked about how much you can really tell that these freshmen are embracing him, and just, man, he's one of those guys that if it was like the NFL or the NBA went right as they retire, you want them to come on as a coach. He's one of those guys that you kind of wish that if that existed, that you would want him to come back to the team, just because of how much respect he got from within the program, outside of the program, how much the fans loved him and everything. So
absolutely.
Let's go on to another player because I do want to wrap up with Archie Miller, since that's obviously a big debatable topic, apparently, especially among Twitter. But let's go to Romeo. Expectations, Romeo's season, the kind of season he had. And I know Matt has some thoughts about this, so I'll kick it to Nathan first, so then Matt can wrap it up. So Nathan, what were your expectations coming in? I think you said it might have been a little optimistic. What are your expectations? What did you see from him? How did he perform, not perform, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I think it's, like I said, maybe a little bit optimistic, but this is a guy who ended the season averaging 16.5 points per game, 5 rebounds. He averaged a couple of assists. This is a guy who, he was perhaps the only player on this team that could consistently create his own shot. And it's not like it's a 5-star strength of his by any means, but whether it's going to the rim and drawing a foul or in a late game situation taking a 3, I mean, Romeo was more often than not the guy to do that. And I'm really curious to see next year, without Juwan Morgan inside and without Romeo Langford sort of slashing to the rim or shooting jumpers, I'm curious to see how IU gets their scoring next season. But maybe that's a topic for later on. As far as Romeo goes, it's going to be look. I think you can kind of you can look if you thought maybe he was going to be better. I get it, but if you thought he was fine, I understand that as well. The one thing I'm going to say, though, is that whether you're on Twitter or Facebook or on campus or whatever, the occasional character assassinations I've seen of Romeo Langford are totally unnecessary. Whether it's related to his in-game attitude, and I'm not just talking about fans. I'm talking about people in the media. I'm talking about people who broadcast games. Like, everyone's talked about Romeo Langford as some sort of disinterested player without any motivation, or he's just in it for the season as a one-year stop to the end. Like, off of that, all right? There's no reason for that kind of commentary. You have no idea what this guy cares about. You have no idea what kind of person he is. All I know is, look, you can say whatever you want about how his season went. It was pretty good. Look, only 3 players have averaged more points per game since 2011 in an IU uniform than Romeo Langford did this year. In fact, it's only 2 players. Yogi Ferrell did it twice. So, look, whatever you want to say about his play, that's one thing. But lay off the character comments. This guy's 19 years old, and who knows what his future has in store for him. But lay off of that.
Yes,
it's like it's like when people say like introverted people aren't necessarily as like cool or good, or they're just not doing as good as extroverted people. Just because they're more shy doesn't necessarily mean that, like you said, Nathan, that their character is any worse. But Matt, what are your thoughts?
I thought Romeo was going to have a more consistent jump shot than he did coming in. I think if I have one gripe about him, it's that, look, he's a freshman. And a lot of times these 5-star factories, they have 5 or 6 of these 5-star freshmen that come in, and they work really well together because guess what? They play in these high school all-star games together. They've played with each other in AAU. Like, this is something they grow up together. This is not joining a new team with people don't really know all that well. Romeo did that and was the leading Big Ten freshman scorer of the year, and had one of the best freshman seasons in the history of IU, up there with like the likes of Eric Gordon. It was a 3rd, right? Yeah. I mean, there's not much more you can ask from the guy. Sure, you can go, well, he only shot 20-something% from 3. Yeah, that sucked. He's had issues with his wrist since high school. I probably heard his shooting form a lot, and he probably went through a bit of a slump this year. That sucks that we got him when that happens. But you can look back at that Marquette game, the way he played. You can look back at any game in the Big Ten season that we were even close in. The reason we were close was either because Juwan was being Juwan or Romeo was being Romeo. Other than that, we weren't even close. The Butler game, I thought Romeo wasn't, perfect, but he was decent enough. I'm trying to think what else. The Michigan State game at Michigan State, he was a huge part of that game. So, I mean, a lot of the bigger memories of all the games, Romeo's right up there in them and is almost the most important part. And I think when a lot of people look back on the season, they'll remember Romeo for the good things he did and not for having a back injury and actually having an injury and having to sit out the NIT, which is unfortunate because he said he would play, but the staff hasn't let him play. So, I'm going to get to see him one last time in an IU uniform. I wouldn't hold out hope that he comes back next year. I think there's about a 0.01% chance he comes back, which is generous to say the least. But yeah, I thought Romeo was excellent this year, and it's just the ups and downs of the season kind of threw a wrench into everything, and it wasn't a good look for him to have an injury here at the end of the season. I feel like IU fans would have had a little bit more respect towards him if he had played in the NIT, but that's not his fault that he tweaked his back. So
I was about to say, you made a good point. It's also not necessarily 100% Romeo's decision if he sits out. There are
Correct.
staff and doctors that will hold him out for the game, regardless of what he wants to do. And if you, I don't know how much Matt got to see during all of the games specifically, but especially during the Arkansas game, they showed the bench reactions a lot when IU was on hot streaks, and I have never seen Romeo that animated. The entire season, he was so animated, he was so into the team doing well. And again, just because he's a shy guy doesn't mean his character's bad, and just because he doesn't want to be a Thomas Bryant energy person on the floor doesn't mean that he's not into the game, invested into the game. Just because his face doesn't show it doesn't mean that he's mentally checked into the game. But the comment I wanted to make the most about Romeo was, at least relative to recent memory, there hasn't been even one IU basketball player that has been able to just make any kind of shot the way Romeo does. When Romeo drives, kicks, does whatever, literally whatever, he's going to find a way for the ball to go into the basket. And it's been a relatively, but it's been a long time since we've seen someone with an IU uniform just drive in, and somehow you see the ball go in various ways, and then it ends up in the hoop. And yeah. I think Indiana fans are going to miss that. And all the stats Matt talked about with being one of the top scorers and for again, like Nathan said, since the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, with him being the third all-time, that's what it used to be. I'm pretty sure it stated the third all-time freshman scorer for Indiana history. Again, like Matt said, next to Eric Gordon, a guy that's thriving in the NBA right now. So just because he wasn't Zion level media attention doesn't necessarily mean that he was a detriment to the team. He had a bad season and everything. Matt, did you have something to follow that up with?
Yeah, I mean, he had incredible media attention at the beginning of the year when we were playing well. It dipped off when Rob Finney got injured and the team, went downhill. If that doesn't happen, who knows what happens? Like we were in the game at Michigan against Michigan, even without a healthy Rob Finney. Like that team and the way they were playing and the confidence they had, who knows what they would have done this season? And who knows, we've been like, we wouldn't go nitpick Romeo's season and be like, well, he can't shoot and he can't drive to the left. So what? So what? Like, he's still, if you get him driving to the right, he's probably the best player in college basketball at finishing around the rim with his right hand. Like, we had that guy on our team, and everybody expected him to come in and average 45 points, 12 rebounds, 14 assists, and 12 blocks. Like, I'm sorry, the guy is it's not Jesus Christ reborn in a basketball player. I mean, it's great that he's from New Albany, Indiana, and it's great that he stayed in state and went to IU, and you should love him for that, and not for, and don't look at the season and be like, wow, he was a disappointment.
Yeah.
I hope that kind of turns off other recruits too. They go, I thought Romeo had a good season, and all these, I'm not going to say what I was going to. All these wonderful IU fans are sitting here yelling into the Twitter space about how Romeo sucks and has, no moral aptitude, and I can't lead a team. And I think that's just wrong, unbelievably, and it's unbelievably uncharacteristic of the love that IU fans have for their players. And I think we should take a look and kind of look at ourselves and go, are we more upset about the season or at the player? Because I think we're more upset about the season than we are at Romeo, and we should take it out on him.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I hope people, even in a month, that they start appreciating a lot of the stuff that they saw from him. And real quick, as a reminder, no matter who declares or whatever, remember, for the NCAA into the NBA, the new rule, you can declare for the draft and come back before that specific date. So even if you see someone like Deron Davis declare for the draft, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to the NBA. Remember that they can still come back. And honestly, if you can go in and get some comments, I don't see why every single person on every single team doesn't go do that. So that's just as a reminder. If Romeo ends up saying, I am declaring for the NBA draft, but he says he's not hiring an agent. That doesn't mean he's 100%. That means he is not 100% committed to going to the NBA yet. So listen to all the terminology. A lot of it's going to get really weird, I guess, with some players. So even if you see, like I said, like even a Justin Smith or something, try and go. They're just testing the water, see what the NBA people say they need to improve on. So just as a reminder again, and I think in terms of Juwan's draft stock, wait to see if he gets a combine invite. That's going to say a lot for what specific NBA scouts are looking for him or not necessarily seeing in him. But I'm going to have Nathan start so he can.
Real quick though, just to wrap up our chat about Romeo there, it wouldn't stun me if he did decide to come back next year.
No.
And the only reason I say that is because, Matt, I think you would look, and again, whatever he does, it's up to him. And I could see both sides of the coin here. But as far as Romeo goes, you had mentioned some clear-cut things that he can improve on. Driving to his left hand or improving his jump shot. If he does those things, I've got to think there's an outside chance that he is the #1 overall pick in next year's draft. Because remember, this season, you're talking about Zion and RJ Barrett and Cam Reddish, Jarrett Culver. Many of those guys play a similar position to Romeo. For example, Barrett, Reddish, and Culver to some degree. Next year, that sort of wing shooting guard kind of position, I'm not going to get into a bunch of details here, but really outside of Anthony Edwards, who is by some measures the #1 overall recruit in the nation, who's going to go to Georgia next year, outside of him, there may not be another player who plays Romeo's position as well as Romeo does. So if Langford thinks maybe he can improve his draft stock, it wouldn't shock me if he did decide to come back next year. I'm not holding out hope, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
I'm not going to let Matt respond, and I'm going to say that maybe next week, unless he declares for the draft and hires an agent, maybe next week or the week after or something, if he doesn't say anything, we might as well have a Romeo show. Because, I mean, is IU going to be better with or without Romeo as a team? There are a lot of questions and a lot of arguments on all of the sides. So we might as well have a nice discussion about it in the coming episodes, since now we have the entire offseason. This is episode #1 of the offseason, which is very sad. But let's, Nathan, I'm going to start with you, and I want you to pick one player that exceeded your expectations. And Matt, you're going to pick a different player after he's done. So think of someone else after Matt thinks, or after Nathan picks one player that exceeded expectations.
I'm going to go with Rob Finney. This is a guy who came in as a freshman. I understand he was sort of in the top 100 of most recruiting rankings, but this guy took over the reins as a starting point guard this year when he was healthy. The numbers don't necessarily pop out, 7 points, 3.5 rebounds, 3 assists per game. But to see
a freshman, as a 4-star point guard freshman, that pops out to me.
You're right. You're right. My point is, it's not like 20 and 10
right.
or something like that. But at the same time, all I saw was this guy, go out there, play as steady of a defense as you could see against some really good point guards. Marcus Howard. You talk about how great of a scorer that guy is. Finney was going up against guys like Carson Edwards, and what a stop he had against Cassius Winston at the end of the game at Assembly Hall to win that one. So to me, it's Rob Finney, and I'm really looking forward to seeing him in the coming years.
All right, what about you, Matt?
All right, so you took my choice because, of course, you did, because it was the easy one. So I'll go with the second easiest one, which is De'Ron Davis for me. I thought De'Ron, going into the year, might not even play this year. There was talk of him maybe even redshirting this year. And, of course, Jerome Hunter ended up redshirting this year, which was detrimental to the team. But that's besides the point. But, yeah, I thought De'Ron needed to redshirt this year because I wasn't sure if he's going to be 100% or not. And, he ended up being one of our most important players down the stretch. Without De'Ron, I don't think we win that Michigan State game. Without De'Ron, I don't think we're even in contention for the NCAA tournament. So I think De'Ron probably was my most surprising player because I didn't expect him to play at all. So
Man, you took mine, and I thought that was going to be a pick that neither of you guys would talk about. I was going to say Duran exceeded expectations because it was because like you said, and then you add out also the leadership on the court. You saw glimpses of the kind of leader that Duran can be next year, and I'm really excited for it. A couple of years ago, we had no leadership on the team after Yogi left. This year, we knew Juwan was the leader. Next year, we know Duran Davis is going to be the leader, and we can talk more about specifics if Devontae is going to come into that specific role, but. I'll give an asterisk to Devontae at the end of the season. We're going to talk a lot about Devontae being consistent, but I guess I'm going to have to go with my third choice, since obviously I would have picked Rob then Duran, but I think Al Durham in a lot of ways exceeded expectations because first of all, I guess he didn't have many expectations, so I think that's an easy way to get around that. But in a lot of ways, you saw the kind of glimpses that he could have to make such a breakout year in his junior year, from going from a sophomore to junior year. He's got a lot of there were a lot of glimpses of him just being really good. He could be one of our shooters next year that can score. You saw the kind of defensive intensity he had, and man, next year having Rob and Al being our two guard defenders, it's going to be so hard for teams to literally, all their guards to literally score at all against them. So I'm going to give a hat tip to Al. Of course, he had ups and downs, and honestly, I think he exceeded expectations. I was texting people over the weekend. I didn't necessarily, I wasn't impressed with a lot of his play last year. I think, again, he had a couple glimpses of good stuff, but I think this year he's showing a lot of signs of maturity, improvement. And remember, during that losing streak, everyone noticed how hard Al was going when other people might not have been bringing as much energy. So there's my pick. Now let's wrap up this discussion with Archie Miller. And again, this could probably be an entire episode itself, but Archie Miller's expectations going into the season. We'll start with Matt. Did Archie exceed, meet, or go below what you personally, and again, these are just our opinions, what you personally thought Archie Miller would do?
I thought he was a bit below. I'll preface that with that he's a young coach who's coming from a conference that, I'm not saying the Atlantic 10's a bad conference, but I'm not saying you're not coaching against the Tom Izzos and the John Beelines and the Chris Holtmans every game in and out. Like, there are some coaches in the Atlantic 10 that aren't that good at what at their job, and that's fine because they're smaller programs and, they're trying to find the next, stud coach, and maybe it doesn't work out. So, but I do think that he's been out-coached a couple times this year, most notably and most recently is the Wichita State game. I thought he was completely out-coached by Greg Marshall, and that's, that's not a bad thing because Greg Marshall's, a top 10 coach in the country, like especially in game. Like, he's very well regarded by the basketball community of how great of a coach he is and what he's done with Wichita State. So that's not an issue. But I thought a couple times this year, like at Rutgers or at Minnesota, not only was he out coached, but he didn't really handle the guy's emotions very well, and you kind of saw that. So I think he's growing and he's learning, and so the fact that he didn't meet my expectations this year is not a bad thing. It's disappointing, but there was also glimpses into seeing him as a great coach, like us sweeping Michigan State this year against Tom Izzo, who's probably the best coach in the league. We swept them this year, and Archie made very good decisions during all those games. He used his timeouts well. He ran very good plays in and out of timeouts. They changed defense and changed things at halftime. We came out better in the second halves of both games. So you can see that Archie knows what he's doing, and there's some promise there. There's just sometimes I'm not sure he knows exactly what to do and how to handle the talent that he has. And I think you saw that with Romeo during stretches of the season, like when we lost 12 or 13 games. So I do think he slightly underperformed my expectations this year. But that being said, that doesn't damper my expectations for his career at IU at all. So, for me, I'll just sum it up by, he didn't meet my expectations, but he wasn't far below my expectations for the season either.
Yeah. What about you, Nathan?
Yeah, I guess I guess since I started this whole thing by saying I expected IU to be better than how they ended, the answer is below. For me, Archie fell below expectations. But the one thing that I've noticed just following this team the last 3 months or so is that right now the Archie, you can define whatever narrative you want right now with Archie Miller. If you think he's a good coach and you think he's the right guy, you can point to the fact, like Matt said, that IU swept Michigan State this year, that IU beat Wisconsin in a big close game at Assembly Hall, that IU's landing big time in-state recruits like Romeo Langford and Trace Jackson Davis.
Yeah.
You can point to those things, and you're right. And then on the other hand, you can say Archie Miller's falling below expectations. And to me, that's where it is right now. I just expected this team to win more games. I'll tell you this: Archie could be, in fact, he is. You can say definitively a good basketball coach. But the question now becomes: is Archie Miller going to be the best coach in the Big Ten? Or is he going to be the 9th or 10th best coach in the Big Ten? Because like Matt said, there are a ton of really good coaches in this league. And, you're going up against Tom Izzo and John Beilein and Greg Gard and Fran McCaffrey and Richard Pitino and Chris Holt. I mean, you could be a good basketball coach and be 9th or 10th best in the league. Tim Miles just found that out yesterday or the day before. So that's where it's all going to come down to. Again, will this season serve as a stepping stone for great things to come? Or is it just a warning sign of a few years where IU sort of treads in the water?
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys said. I would even I'm going to change. You both said didn't meet. I think met expectations for me because I guess I was more. I don't want to say realistic. I guess I was I wasn't as optimistic coming into the season just because again it's a second year coach. I'm a first year teacher. I'm coming into new schools and trust me, kids do not trust you as much when you're brand new, and it's I'm finding out right now. I'm in about the January or February of IU's equivalent of the season where the kids are now comfortable, but they might start to rebel a little bit. So you just got to rein it back in. And Matt stole my main point talking about how he's a really, really young coach. You see a lot of these other big coaches out there. There's up and coming coaches that might be a little older, but a little more in the spotlight. They've been assistants on really high powered basketball teams. You've seen a lot of these big coaches starting to come through assistants with Coach K, maybe Jim Boeheim or Tom Izzo. Some of these older coaches, they've been on Power 5 teams and they've seen that kind of success. They've seen that high talent and everything. Because remember, Archie could make those Dayton players, those players that are those 3-star caliber players to have consistent NCAA tournament success. And again, we keep coming back to it, and it almost sounds as like a cop-out right now, but again, he doesn't have his players. When he put his foot down and he said this year that it's going to be his way or basically you're not going to play, that's when the season turned a corner. The players started to buy into what he said after losing sight of what he said. And along the way, like you guys said, like Matt especially said, he made mistakes, but he's learning from them too. Mm-hmm. He's such a young coach, and this is his first time really seeing this level of talent and this level of coach. And he can make mistakes too as a coach. And I think he learned a lot this season. And I think there are so many things next year that he's going to be ready for, because he's now learned how to use a 5-star player. So he's going to have Trace come in there next year. He's learned where he can push his team, where he needs to press buttons. And again, it's going to be his team next year, since he's had these guys now for a couple of years. So he knows specifically that this team responds to whatever he did before the turnaround, winning 6 out of 8 games at the end of the season. So I think he met expectations, and I didn't necessarily think he would be. I think the ceiling was, if you remember me talking at the beginning, was a 3, 4, 5, 6 seed in the tournament. But I think his expectation was around the bubble, which he was, and of course not getting into the tournament makes everything literally 100% completely different. I think that the tone of this podcast would be 100% 180 if we got into the tournament and lost the first game. I think everyone would be saying he met expectations, and literally that's a 1 or a 2 game difference, which for me, of course, it's really bad when you don't get into the tournament. I'm not excusing that whatsoever, but if you look at his overall season, and if you're saying, yes, he met expectations, or no, he didn't by 1 game, I think it's close enough to say that he still met expectations. So that's my rant on Archie Miller. And of course, we can talk about him forever, because if there's one guy that's going to stay consistent on the team in the near future, it's Archie Miller. So we can dive into a little deeper about what he's doing with the program and how he's going to get this Indiana team back to glory. And I will say this. All of the good juju is over now. Next year, it's NCAA tournament, or I will even be upset with Archie Miller. Next year is the breaking year. So let's move on to some questions, because there are a couple really good questions. IU Colts Pacers Cubs on Twitter said, who are the top 5 JUCO or 5th-year targets that can shoot, hustle, understand situational awareness, and bring leadership qualities? And I'm going to slightly tweak this question to just putting it all over who are the top 5 transfer people that can come into IU and have some of those qualities that Indiana needs. Nathan, I know you got a list of a couple people. So what are some quick people that we could be on the lookout for?
Yeah, and in fact, the guys that I'm going to reel off are immediately eligible. So these guys are graduate transfers who IU can pick up and plug in for next season. There are a few guards out here. Ray John Tucker, he's a guy who played for Arkansas Little Rock last year. He's a guy who played a ton of minutes. He's very willing to shoot the basketball from distance. TJ Holyfield is another one. Holyfield is a guy who played at Stephen F. Austin. I know some folks might remember that name from recent NCAA tournaments. Yeah. Holyfield is a guy who played 27 minutes a game last year for Stephen F. Austin and shot 41% from 3. Jahad Proctor is a guard out of High Point. Similar mold, similar build, as is Justin Pierce from William and Mary. One sort of bonus guy here. Remember Aaron Falzone from Northwestern? The guy who had the game of his life at Welsh Ryan Arena when IU went there back in January. He's a grad transfer, and I don't know if a Big Ten team is in his sights, but I thought that was an interesting name when I was scrolling through the available transfers.
Nice. Matt, do you have anyone specific, or was that a good list from within?
That was a good list. I mean, I'd add non-seniors to that, so somebody like a Kevin Easley, who played at Chattanooga, right? And he was the SoCon Freshman of the Year, and he's from Indianapolis. He averaged like 18 points per game as a freshman, which is nuts, and like almost had 40% shooting from 3. If he can come in and maybe get eligibility as a sophomore, he'd be a great person to look at. Or look at somebody like Akira Lewis, who Alabama just fired their head coach. He was a 5-star guard, and we were looking at him last year. So if you go back around this time last year, we were probably talking about him on the recruiting trail as well. So
we were.
Yeah. So somebody like him as well. But they're not grad transfers. They'd be here for multiple years. But I think both of them would be, very good options to look at if somebody like Harlan Beverly and Lester Quinones both commit like we think they are to other programs. And I think they would be more than welcome additions to this IU team.
Yeah, which Harvin Beverly just got an offer from Kansas too. So we're now not the only ones that are seeing what everyone else is seeing with Harlan Beverly. But we can talk a little bit more about those transfer people, especially as the Indiana roster specifically starts to shape up a little more. Does Romeo officially commit to leaving? Are there going to be any transfers on the team? So like how many scholarship spots are open up? Because there is a scenario where we have no more scholarship spots and all of this talk is non-existent. I don't think that's going to happen, but there is a scenario like that. So we'll update things, especially as the season goes on. The off season is coming on for a lot of most teams, all but 16 teams. So the next one, Bruce from Twitter. And again, this is going to be more in-depth question is going to come if we do an Archie Miller podcast episode all in itself. But is Archie in over his head? Why did he fight to save Tom Crean recruits? So that first for me, is he in over his head? No. I think he's a young coach like we talked about. He still has a lot of successes that other coaches might not have had coming into the program. Why did he have to fight to save Tom Crean recruits? First of all, they weren't his guys. It's not his style of play. They might not have bought into what he was saying. Those kids might not have been in a good place in their life when they were listening to Archie, and Archie's a stubborn guy with the way he wants to play basketball. So I don't necessarily think he was fighting to save them. And if him fighting to save them, it's also Archie trying to do the player a service and saying, hey, I don't want you to have to leave and go somewhere else in the country. If they're comfortable going to IU, you want them to always stay at IU, even if they might necessarily be on a better scheme at some other school. You don't ever want to see a kid leave just because it's hard on everyone. It's hard on them. It's hard on their families. So anything different, Nathan?
No, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head. Going back to Archie real quick, though, like I said, look, at this point, after just 2 seasons, there are arguments to both sides. So all I'm going to say is I don't know if he's in over his head yet. Time will tell. And it's got to start next season.
Yeah, I agree. No. Will he be? I don't know. Good clarification. Matt, what about you? Is he in over his head? Why do you have to save? Anything to add?
No, I don't think he's over his head. I don't think he's nothing to add, really.
It's such a competitive league, though. That's the thing that concerns me the most about IU going forward.
Yeah, man, yeah, it really is, and especially after this year, Indiana, in all intents and purposes, they actually had not a bad year if it was just a regular Big Ten year, but everyone was just so good that they were at the bottom end of everything. But frame by frame hoops, this is a great question. With 2 women's basketball 5 stars coming, and then Trace Jackson coming for the men's, who has the deeper season next year, the men or the women? Matt and I talked about this before, so I'm going to get Nathan's opinion first. Who has the deeper? Oh, I will preface this. Remember, men is losing Juwan, probably Romeo, and Zach. The women are only losing Kim Royster, a player that contributed, but it was not a starter and not a significant down the stretch.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to go with the women. They had a deeper run this year. I guess. Yeah, they did have a deeper run. No. I guess the men played 2 days later than the women did. But next year, I think it's going to be the women
games. So
yeah, if we're talking about sort of meaningful, deeper run, I think it's going to be the women. They're going to be really fun to watch next year. If you're in the Bloomington area for the next year, I would absolutely recommend you go to Assembly Hall and watch them because they play a fun style of basketball. Lots of ball movement, player movement, good jump shooters. It's a good product.
What about you, Matt?
Yeah, I'm going to say the same thing. You know, they have almost 5-star recruits in now every position now. You know, point guard, shooting guard, 2 forward positions. I think the only one that's not a 5-star is Brenna Wise, who was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school. She went to Pittsburgh and then transferred. So, I mean, Allie Patberg is a wonderful point guard. You know, she's a gem of a player. You really should go see her while she's still at IU. A 5-star center coming in, a 5-star forward coming in, 5-star forwards from Indianapolis area, I believe. And then another guard coming in. But, the senior we're losing, Kim, well, she's a wonderful person and a very decent player. She was not the most important player. And in fact, we played the sophomore or junior center, Lindsay, more than we played her against Oregon and in the NCAA tournament. So it's not like we're losing somebody of extraordinary importance to this team.
It's not like the men's. It's not like the men's losing Juwan or Romeo.
It's not losing like Juwan, right? But maybe she's important in the locker room, and I don't doubt that. But it's her on-court product can definitely be replaced, and I do think this IU women's team will, maybe move some heads in this direction come next year. And I think Terry Morin's here for the long haul. I don't think she's just here to as a stop and then move on to something like Tennessee. I don't think that's the case at all.
I'm going to say,
by the way, just to put some, Jory Allen and Mackenzie Holmes are the 5-star recruits coming into the women's program next season.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm definitely going to say the women's team, and just because, again, look what they did this year when they lost two of the best players in Indiana women's basketball history. They got farther than that team did last year. So, well, they got to the NCAA tournament, even though that team definitely did win the NIT tournament. But the only caveat I will put, and if you really go to the meaning of the question, deeper season next year, the drop off from the women's talent from the top to even the bottom of the NCAA tournament is huge for the women's side. So the Indiana playing Oregon this past weekend was humongous. It was almost like Indiana playing Duke in the second round kind of thing. It just, the talent drop off is huge. And that's no disrespect to Indiana whatsoever. Just the women's basketball talent is so weighted very differently than almost any college league. But that's why I say the only caveat I might put is if the men do get into the tournament, they could still be around the same seed, even if the women are winning more games, having a better conference record. The men could still be seated as high or higher and win more games, just because the top level competition of the women's the women's league is just so high. Like if you get that 8, 9, or 10 seed in the women's tournament, you will play 1 or a 2 seed that second game if you win, which is huge. Those top 8 seeds in the women's tournament are always the teams that are going to win the NCAA tournament. There's almost no debate. But long story short, women's basketball. And since this podcast has gone long, we have just one quick question before wrapping it up. Is Justin Smith transferring? Saw someone make this comment on Twitter the other day. No, at least as of Wednesday at 9:36 p.m. Eastern time. No, he's not transferring. I don't think it's fair to speculate anyone transferring necessarily. So until someone literally announces that they're transferring, I don't even think it's right for the players for us to even speculate that. So I think that's an easy answer, at least no, because if someone was transferring, everyone would know about it. That's not really I think this is going to happen. It's not like a recruit. I think this recruit's going to come to Indiana. You're going to know if it's actually credible information. But that about wraps it up for our 81st show of the Hoosier Sound. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We really appreciate your support. I'm going to be back this Friday for another edition of the Hoosier Sound Off. Big thanks to our live audience for coming out and participating in the chat. Make sure to stay tuned through updates on Twitter. Visit our website, indianahq.com, and subscribe so you can get all these episodes right to your phone. Send us your questions to the audience so we can get them on our next episode. But most importantly, if you enjoy the show, leave us a review on iTunes or Facebook. Tell a friend, share our links. Your support is how we grow this podcast to reach more passionate IU fans such as yourself. But as always, thank you for listening, Hoosier Nation, and we'll see you next time.